Hello everyone, my name is Jess and happy Pride Month to you all. When I first started watching BookTube and I started reading more and wanting to sort of join this community, something that I was really interested in was LGBT plus literature for young people, and wondered sort of what I should read, what I should be wary of, what I should be looking for in books I wanted to read about these sorts of characters and this population in the BookTube community. Today I'm going to be going through a small sort of history of LGBTQ plus representation in YA, and also I'm going to be talking about some things that you should look out for, some things that you should avoid when trying to find stories about people who are LGBTQ plus. More disclaimer, and I need to make this. One, all of the research that I've used for this video is going to be linked down below, so you can check out whether or not you think that I've got something wrong. Please let me know. I want to be as accurate as possible with this video. Secondly, I'm going to be using the phrase LGBT plus and LGBTQ plus. I know that there are many more letters that people want to add to this, but it would just make things a lot more difficult for me to say and for everything to get across to you, the viewer. So I don't mean to exclude anyone, and also I may or may not use the word queer every so often, and I apologise if this offends anyone. I personally, as a bisexual woman, feel as though this label is quite accurate for me, and I do agree with the usage of it. However, if you don't like it, I'm sorry about that. Maybe you shouldn't watch this video. So I'm going to start off with telling you a bit of history of LGBT plus identities in YA, and sort of where this came from, how it started and how it's grown over the years. In 1969, the first gay YA book was published, and it was called I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip, and it was by a man called John Donovan. Obviously there had been books about gay people and things like that in the past. They'd mainly been adult books, and there'd also been YA books, but this was the first gay YA book, and 1969 sounds quite recent, right? However, there was a few problems with this book. First being that the main character was gay in this book, and he has his first sexual experience with a boy, and then his dog dies, and the book sort of makes him act as if he's assuming that the dog's died because he's done this act, and it's quite shameful and, you know, all that bad stuff. This book was also published just weeks before the first Stonewall riots, so it was at a time when a lot of these issues were up in the air in the public eye. A lot of early LGBT plus YA stories, or I might just say LG because let's get real, that's all they were, centred around a lot of tragedy and include a lot of death, especially around main characters' loved ones, and sort of a lot of tragedy centred around the idea of homosexuality and different identities, which is a slight problem. You know, representing these identities as shameful is something that I'm glad has definitely dialed down a bit in the past 50 years or so. In 1982, a novel called Annie on My Mind by Nancy Garden reversed this sad shit trend and basically gave us a happy-go-lucky, friends to lovers lesbian story, which personally I really like, I am here for. However, then after it was published, Annie on My Mind was actually banned. Yikes. And this might seem like quite a bit of a time jump, but by 1992, you know, about 30 years after the first gay YA book, around 60 gay YA books had actually been published at this point. However, many of these were only defined as LGBT YA books because of LGBT plus side characters that were included. It was nothing about main characters. There wasn't a lot of talk about the subject, only that there were characters in these books that were in this group. And obviously all of these stories were overwhelmingly white, only 3 out of those 60 featuring any queer people of colour. In 1976, a book called Ruby by Rosa Guyot was the first known novel about a queer girl, and not only was this amazing, but it was also centred on a queer teen of colour, which is something that, you know, even by 1992, like 20 years after this happened, was still nowhere in sight. So, well done, Rosa Guy. The early 2000s also saw an explosion of LGBT plus YA literature with more focus on letters other than the LG. So we had more bisexual literature, more trans literature for teens as well. However, trans YA was virtually non-existent up until Julianne Peters' novel Luna, which again didn't even focus on the main character as trans. It was the main character's sister who was coming out as a trans girl, and they were both trying to come to terms with that, I believe, in 2004. Crazy. Going back a little bit again, in 1997 we had the first instance of a self-identified bisexual character in YA literature, and that was in M. Ika's Hello, I Lied. However, another shocking thing, we've heard a little bit about books being banned up to this point, but another fact that literally blew me away was the fact that in 1998, Section 28 came into place, which was in the UK, which was a law banning the intentional promotion of homosexuality in books. Like, what? And get this, the law wasn't revoked until 2003. Despite huge amount of progress being made in the inclusion of this representation in YA literature, queer and YA books are still disproportionately white and cis, and they definitely do depend on the LG part of LGBT+, which is, you know, great that we've got so much representation now. However, we still need to see more varied stories and experiences come through. As well as this, there's also a lean towards cis boys and being gay rather than being lesbian. One of the articles that I read actually found that the ratio of mentions of LGBT boys to LGBT girls was 2:1, which is quite staggering. So that was my relatively short history of LGBT representation in YA. And obviously it's not a comprehensive sort of list. Again, I'm linking the research that I found down below, and if you have anything else that you want to say towards it, then please let me know. I'd love to learn about the history of this, as it's clearly something very important to me. However, with that being said, I do think that it's important that with this new influx of representative content coming forward, such as books with LGBT+ representation, that we really need to be sure that the content we're consuming is helpful and not hurtful. And I know that can be confusing sometimes for a lot of people, especially if you're sort of new to this sort of thing. So I've created a little tiny list of things that we should look out for when you're reading books with this sort of content about what is helpful and what is harmful and how to avoid it. One of the things that should be avoided is unnecessary tragedy befalling LGBT characters. As we saw from our first gay YA book, which was I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Wait, a lot of tragedy used to befall these characters back in the day when LGBT stories were very new and a lot of attitudes still were very negative. So with the unnecessary tragedy befalling these characters, it sort of promotes the idea that we should be punished for our identities, and although it's obviously not stated, and you know, sometimes these things that happen to these characters are, you know, coincidental or realistic, a lot of the time they're not. And it's important to be able to distinguish that. Another thing that we should really be wary of in LGBT literature is the harmful stereotypes, and we've all seen them, we all know what they are. There's the flamboyantly offensive gay person, and then there's the cheating bisexual, there's the so butch that they're violent and aggressive lesbian, and it's all these sort of stereotypes that we've all seen and we all know about. It's pretty obvious, just don't read them and don't write them. Another thing that we need to look out for in this literature is internalized homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, etc. And it can be hard to find, you know, because it's internalized. It is internalized into all of us in some ways, and some ways that we can sort of search for them is, how does the story come across? You know, what is the message it's sending about these identities? Is it in the end saying that LGBT people don't deserve to be treated exactly the same as everyone else, or is it saying that they do? Or, you know, what is that distinction that the writer is making? And that's really where their priorities lie. And finally, the last thing that should be looked out for in LGBTQIA literature, especially when it's going towards young people, is there representation for the sake of saying there is? And this is quite a big issue at the moment, I feel, within the YA sort of reading community, and it's whether or not the author actually has realistic, useful, you know, varied voices of representation in their work, or have they just put a person of colour who is disabled and trans and a lesbian, they just put that person, the one token person, in for the sake of it? Do they have any other traits other than their identity? Do they have, you know, a 3D nature to their character? Do they have other things going on in their life apart from the struggle with identity, etc.? That's really what we need to be looking out for, is those characters that are 3D, that have things going on, that aren't just struggling with their shameful identity, especially if this person doesn't do anything else for the plot of the story other than to exist as a person that is representing a single population or multiple populations that are in the minority. But on a happier note, something that I thought would be extra useful would be listing some things that we do want to look out for in LGBTYA, and things that we can celebrate, and when you see it, recommend it to other people. It's those sort of things that, rather than just focusing on the negative and things that we don't want, we should focus on the things that we do want, so that people can make more of this content. So things to look out for would be reflections of your experiences, your personal experiences, whether you are gay, straight, trans, cis, whatever you are. If it represents your experience, it's something helpful. Having content that voices your experience is really invaluable, and if it makes you feel heard, then there's nothing wrong with that. Another thing to look out for is content that focuses on LGBT characters that are respectful of boundaries and knowing when to stop and when to not show something. For example, in YA literature, having sex scenes can be controversial, especially if these sex scenes or intimate scenes between two characters are included in the LGBT sort of area. And it's great to have representation of those sort of events, but it's also important to be careful of boundaries and not make these things into sort of a fetish or something that is almost perverse and trying to be perverse. It should always be respectful and realistic. And one of the biggest things that is important to look for in this sort of content is own voices. If you don't know what own voices means, it's basically where a writer that is writing about a character who is part of a minority group, such as a black character, an Asian character, a trans character, or a lesbian character, anything like that. It's when they are what they are writing about, so they know exactly, they're literally writing from their own experience. That is what own voices is, and it's something really, really invaluable to us as human beings. Learn from other people's exact experiences. If they are part of that group, they obviously are going to write as realistically and respectfully as they possibly can. And that is something that I've learned is really, really important to me to read now, is stories that aren't just about these groups, but from these groups as well. Going back to the token minority characters that are just there because they need the story to be diverse, it's important to have characters, storylines that don't just focus on the fact that they are gay or a lesbian or bisexual or trans. It's important to have aspects of the storyline that don't focus on that, because that is not all we are. And that's pretty obvious, but sometimes easy to forget. And overall, it's really just looking for stories that tell our experiences and experiences of everyone in the population with respect, without harmful narrative. You see, sometimes real life does include tragedy, and sometimes real life is not perfect and it's not nice or respectful, but it's the way we tell these stories, and that needs to be respectful, and that's really all there is to it. I'm gonna go now, my voice is hurting, and I hope that was as educational as I hoped it was gonna be. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and comment down below what you thought about it. If you have anything else to add that, you know, I could learn or anyone else could learn, that would be great. And if you liked this, then please subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a happy Pride Month, guys. Bye.